conversation is to talk about bridging the transatlantic issues and challenges and work and the Transpacific. So I want to talk about, I want to ask you the dilemma that I have in Washington when we talk about great power competition. So in Washington, as I'm reading the unclassified overview of the U.S. National Defense Strategy, it says China is the pacing challenge, the most significant challenge, and Russia is a second challenge. We have to keep our eyes on that long-term challenge. Yet yesterday, Congressman Costa, I believe, absolutely rightly said that this war is the greatest challenge of our time. Yet, Senator Risch, in the letter that you put over this important report that you've and your staff worked on a transatlantic roadmap for China, you said, we must be prepared to work with our trusted allies and partners to counter an increasingly confrontational China that attempts to undermine prosperity, security, and good governance in every region of the globe. I consider this foreign policy issue to be the most important of our time. We have two crises that are the most important of our time. Do we have to prioritize one over the other, or can we do both? Senator Risch.
Well, in my defense, when I wrote that...
I did not mean to put words in, but it was powerful. It was powerful.
I still stand by that statement. But having said that, you know, we all made a big mistake when the Iron Curtain came down. We all thought, well, Russia now is going to take a deep breath and join the international community and do things the way civilized people do things. And, you know, they did some bad things over the time. There's no question about it. They poison people once in a while. They interfere with elections. They do cyber things. Those are all bad things, but yeah, other countries do some of that too. Who'd have guessed that they were going to start a medieval war in the 21st century? When I wrote that, that was way beyond any thought that I had. I think beyond the thought that the world had. I mean, what they're doing there is just absolutely atrocious, and it certainly diverts our focus from the China issue. As I was preparing for this, as you mentioned, I just came off of Ukraine. Of course, when I left Washington, D.C., we've got a number of domestic issues back there that are biting us. So it's hard to focus on China, and China's a long way away. But you have to take a deep breath and realize, look at what China has done over the last few years, the last 10 years, the last 3 decades. Look what they've done, and then realize that this is an existential challenge for us. It's a challenge to the world, to the world order. They are a competitor, mostly, I think, culturally, but also economically and militarily. But again, most people don't have a clue, unless you work in this space, of how they infiltrate all aspects of societies in all parts of the world. Vicki and I were, by the way, say hello to Idaho's former First Lady. Vicki, where are you?
Where's Mrs. Risch? Where are you? There she is. Thank you.
We were in Africa a couple of years ago, and this is something that I was astounded at. When you fly intra-Africa on an airline, you look around, there are more Chinese people on the airline than there are African people. And so all of a sudden, it brings home to you the effort that they're putting forth everywhere.
Absolutely. Mr. McAllister, can we do both? Can both Russia and China be the challenges of our times, or do we just have to prioritize? And for Europe, I keep hearing this, and Belgian Prime Minister De Croo yesterday, and I think he was sharing the sentiment I think I've heard expressed across Europe that, you know, China's too important of an economic market for us. We cannot treat China like Russia. But yet we see China's growing intimidation. It's challenging of international maritime law in the South China Sea, human rights issues. That's very much been a discussion of the German government. Recently, the European Parliament is a very strong voice there. Can we send strong messages to both, or is it a China first, or is it a Russia first? What's your thoughts on that?
We have to do both, and we can do both.
Yes.
Short and midterm, of course, the question is how to deal with the Russian Federation. Russia is our immediate neighbor, and there will be a time after this war. And the big question will be, how can we as civilized democracies in Europe deal with a neighbor as long as Mr. Putin is in power? Russia is a bully. Russia is an aggressive bully. Russia is a very dangerous bully. And we have seen, not only since the 24th of February, but for the last 15, 20 years, how Russia, step by step, has tried to destabilize Europe and our immediate neighborhood. The Russian invasion in Georgia, 2008, the activities in Moldova, Transnistria, the Russian atrocities committed in Syria, the Russian activities in Libya or in other countries of Northern Africa. The repeated attempts to destabilize our democracies, especially in our eastern EU partner countries, the support for radicals, the spread of fake news and disinformation. Putin's Russia is just awful, but we will have to try and cope with this situation, especially after the Russian Federation has destroyed the peace and security architecture which lasted even in the coldest weeks and months of the Cold War. The institutions, how are we going to have a future organization of the OSCE or the Council of Europe? How are we going to find some kind of diplomatic contacts between NATO and the Russian Federation? And also, what does this all mean for binding treaties which we shared, like the Paris Charter or the Final Act of Helsinki? So this will be a huge challenge for European and transatlantic foreign policy. And on China, we are waiting for the High Representative of the European Union, Mr. Borrell, to present the updated EU-China strategy. And of course, we will have to reflect three things. I think the three English C's best describe how we deal with China here in Europe. We cooperate where possible, for instance, on climate change. We compete where needed. But if we want to have fair economic competition, we need a real level playing field, especially for our small and medium-sized enterprises. And all European companies who have been operating on the Chinese market know that there is no level playing field, that it's unfair. But of course, we also have to confront China. And what people underestimated in Europe was that we hoped that doing more trade with China would lead to democratic reforms. This has not materialized. China is a systemic rival, a geostrategic competitor, and we have to be very clear that we have very, very different views. Final point, we Europeans should try to, as closely as possible, coordinate our updated China strategy with our American and Canadian partners.
A quick question to you both. What do you believe China has understood from the war in Ukraine? And what do you believe Taiwan has learned from the war in Ukraine?
I believe that China has been following our reactions since the 24th of February extremely closely, and I think that the Chinese are impressed by the unity of the Western allies. We haven't seen such close cooperation between the EU, the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and others, like we have seen since the 24th of February. The unity of the West, that was very important. And the second point is that the Chinese, much more than the Russians, of course, fear economic sanctions, because unlike the Russians, who can only sell gas, oil, and coal to us, and they're not really very interesting for us in Europe, what they produce on the market, Chinese have interesting products for us in Europe, just like we have interesting products for the Chinese markets. And that's why if we in Europe get our act together and combine our economic power we have with more political power, then I think we can also make a difference in dealing with China.
Senator?
Really well said. First of all, I don't think that the way you put the question, what have they learned, I don't think they're done learning yet. They're watching day by day. And more importantly, I think they're going to watch and see what happens after the fact. When this is over in Ukraine, it's not over. This is going to have a tail on it for a long, long time for the Ukrainians, for generations to come. I deal with them daily in D.C. and now there. these people are hurt, they're angry, and rightfully so, with the atrocities that have been committed by Russia. This is going to go on for a long, long time. In addition to that, because we did misjudge Russia and did a lot of things, we're going to be doing things differently. Our European friends are really we're quickly to the party to realize that their entire energy industry is going to have to be revisited and redone. And there's a lot of other things. There's 700 American companies that have withdrawn from Russia. They are not going to go rushing back in there. It's just not going to happen. So what happens after the fact, I think, is going to be very important. And certainly from a military aspect, China is watching that. But I think something that's probably lost on us is they're going to be looking at the fallout to Russia after this, after the shooting stops. And that fallout is going to be very, very dramatic over the long haul for Russia.
So you believe, Senator, there'll be real costs Sino-Russian alignment? I mean, that's the way it sounded to me. I don't want to put words in your mouth.
No, I'm not sure of that. You know, the Russians and the Chinese are not natural allies. Sometimes they act like it because they have things that they have in common, the way they think. But there's one thing we know about both of these countries, that people try to think of them in the same bucket, and they're two different fish. There's no question about it. You always, they're looking for upheaval. They're looking for incivility. They're looking to cause trouble. With the Chinese, just hang on to your wallet while you're talking to them, and everything will be okay. We can say one thing for sure about the Chinese that we know: they will always, always do what's right for China, regardless of whether it's right or wrong.
Mr. McAllister, at the G7 summit, there was a big announcement, a partnership for global infrastructure. This is in some ways, to your point, relationship, the G7 countries trying to counterbalance Belt and Road. How do you judge or rate Europe's global gateway projects so far? The EU's answer to this. Do you think it is sufficient? Are we too late? That we've already allowed Chinese influence to grow in key markets? And then, Senator, I'll ask you, and then I want to bring others into the conversation.
Well, Global Gateway Europe was overdue.
Long overdue.
For many years, the European Parliament had said not only should we be complaining about the Belt and Road Initiative, but we have to offer an interesting alternative. And it took quite a while until the United States and Europe understood that infrastructure policy is always geopolitical when dealing with the Chinese. Now we have these alternatives. We're putting a lot of money on the table, and we have to do that. We have to convince our partners in Latin America, in Africa, and especially in the entire Indo-Pacific that cooperating with the United States and the European Union might be a little more challenging because we ask more about environmental standards, about human rights and other questions, but it's sustainable. And we don't want to create dependencies like the Chinese, and we don't want to exercise political influence on these countries, but we want to really bring the world together. And we in Europe are so dependent on an open and free access to the Indo-Pacific that we have a very own interest in supporting these infrastructure projects and combining this with our political ambitions. So I very much welcome that the G7 leaders have announced this additional funding, and we should invest it smartly. And we are already in a direct competition with China, and we've lost a lot of valuable time.
Absolutely. Quick question, Senator Risch, to you. As I'm on my way this evening to Madrid, we're hearing reports that the NATO strategic concept on China, according to Mr. Stoltenberg, that China will be termed a challenge to our interest, our security, and our values. Is that strong enough language for you from where you sit?
Probably. I think that it is important to understand how China plays into this. And all of this that's happened, I think in the years I've been doing this, I've never seen the Europeans and U.S. Closer. There was a horrible mistake that Putin made. I'm certain that he believed that an invasion of Ukraine would split NATO. That has done absolutely the opposite. And I don't think it's too late. You always have to make judgments based upon where you stand right now. And we've learned a lot about both China and Russia in the recent decade, and we need to adjust things in that regard. As the challenge that has been referred to here, that China is getting into all aspects of life in all countries, is a huge deal, and we have to respond to that. And as has been pointed out, we always have to offer, we can't just say no, we have to offer alternatives. And as has been pointed out, dealing with those of us that come from free and democratic societies where we don't believe in corruption, we don't believe in bribery, we value human rights really above all. For a lot of countries, this is a challenge, particularly ones that lean more towards autocracy than democracy. But that doesn't mean it can be ignored. It's got to be dealt with.
Well, I agree. Always provide a positive alternative. We learned that in the 5G debate as well. Okay, I want to take one question from this side and one question from this side, and we're going to do it rapid fire because I have 2 minutes. Kevin, we'll have the microphone back here, and ma'am, right there. Okay. Kevin.
Thank you. I'm Kevin Barron. I'm the executive editor of Defense One, a Pentagon-focused publication, national security publication. I wonder if you could both talk about how your constituencies, Americans, Europeans, view China and the battle over convincing them what to think about China. I've written a lot and reported a lot about how in the United States there is a bit of a battle of whether or not you can do business with China and still call yourself a patriot. We hear it a lot from the far right, a lot from the far left. So where are you on that spectrum, and what kind of message are you giving to your constituencies? Where do you think the people need to be, and how much does it really matter what the people think versus what, as you said, Senator, the leaders, people in the space think about China?
Okay, hold that. We're going to take one and very, very quick.
Hello, Teresa Fallon, Center for Russia, Europe, Asia Studies. Thank you so much for your comments. Since this is supposed to combine transatlantic relations and the Indo-Pacific, we see that the Europeans have a very different perception of China. And what concrete ways do you see them working together on these issues? There's questions of burden shifting in regard to NATO, and how do we see Europe maybe picking up or some sort of division of labor in the Indo-Pacific? On a promising note, the incoming Czech presidency of the European Council on July 1st, they will have an Indo-Pacific strategy. So they're pushing that very hard. So this is a promising sign for a landlocked country. And I would say that France as well and Sweden will continue with the Indo-Pacific. But how do we work with the US and Europe together on this?
Thank you. Mr. McAllister, I'll turn to you first, and then Senator Risch, you can have the last word, please.
Okay, 2 comments on the Indo-Pacific. I very much welcome that the European Union for the first time presented its own EU Indo-Pacific strategy last year, after France, Germany and the Netherlands, who had their own national strategies. For the first time, the EU has taken a united approach towards the region. And I think what is characterizing for this EU approach is it's inclusive. We try to bring cooperation to as many partners as possible in the region, but we've also set our priorities. It's the like-minded democracies, it's the like-minded partners who are our key partners in the region: Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, India, and also the countries of ASEAN. Here we see a lot of common ground. I think that apart from the economic aspects in the Indo-Pacific, I welcome that now there's a closer angle on foreign and security-related issues. Not only is France the only European Indo-Pacific nation with the French overseas territories, but we've also seen some military presence now from the Germans, from the Dutch. I mean, of course, this is symbolic, but it shows the region. We in Europe have our very own interests, and we want to have an open and free access to the Indo-Pacific, safe maritime routes, especially in the South China Sea. So that's for one point. And the other point, how do our constituents perceive China? Well, luckily, I can travel home every weekend from Brussels to my hometown in North Germany. I spend a lot of time speaking to people. I've noticed in recent years how there's been a shift in my home country, Germany, towards China. It's much more critical than a few years ago. And I would say it was two events which actually changed the public debate. The one thing is Hong Kong, when the Chinese communists cracked the liberal movement in Hong Kong. That showed us that they are ideologically aggressive and that you cannot trust and rely on them. So a clear breach of all international agreements. And the other game changer was the outrageous reports from Xinjiang, how the Chinese are treating the Uyghurs. This is the most severe and systematic breach of human rights, I would say, in decades. And the world has been far too silent for far too long what the Chinese communists are doing here in the western provinces of China. So this has really changed the narrative. And if you look at the polls, Germans are much more in favor of us taking a more critical stance towards the communist leadership. So I think we're seeing more an alignment of US and European interests. Of course, two differences. We Europeans are not a Pacific nation apart from the French, so we don't have the immediate confrontation in the Pacific like our American allies and partners. And of course, we're doing more business with China. But also here I can see that more and more also big industrial firms in Germany are starting to question, what does this all mean for us if we get too dependent on the Chinese market?
Exactly. Senator, you give the last word.
Could we get some easy questions on the next round?
These guys are really good.
All right.
Sorry.
Let me try to be brief on both of those so we can get to as many questions as we can. When I wrote this report, it is really focused on the relationship between Europe and the United States, and that relationship as it relates to China. Look, we have to do this together. There are about 650 million of us in Europe and the United States. China has about 1.5 billion people. We are greatly outmatched numerically. Having said that, individually, we are not going to be a match for the Chinese in the short run or the long run, for that matter. If we do this together, and we got a long ways to go if we're going to start pulling the cart together, but we have to pull the cart together. We have a whole lot more in common, obviously, than either of us do as far as the Chinese are concerned. So we really need to focus on that. We need to do more on that. We have our squabbles, as we've always had, and we'll always have that. Any kind of relationship has squabbles. We haven't been very good at resolving those sometimes. Boeing, Airbus, as an example, and some others. But those are de minimis compared to the overall confrontation between China and us as a culture. So this has got to be done. As far as constituencies are concerned, the constituencies I think in the United States are much slower to get their arms around this than those of us that are on the front line fighting the battle. I agree completely that there are some things that have happened in China which have underscored this greatly, not the least of which is the treatment of the Uyghurs. I mean, look, that's how they treat all their people. It just got on the front pages because you had this great mass of people, and they were they were pushing back, and so the Chinese did what the Chinese do, and that is they can always be tougher, and they were. And people are going, what is this? How can this be happening in the 21st century? It's happening. It's real, and it's China.
Senator, thank you. Again, I shout out to a great report that is a great roadmap. I think we just heard the two taglines, strength and unity, and let's pull the cart together. Mr. McAllister, Senator Risch, thank you so much for a fantastic discussion. Please join me in thanking them. All right. So, as we will just ask you, we're going to quickly change the set, but thank you both so much. And please join me in welcoming virtually the Foreign Minister of Taiwan, Mr. Joseph Wu, as well as Senator Chris Murphy, and our very own Laura Thornton, who leads our Alliance for Securing Democracy. And we're going to keep digging into, again, the power of democracy as we think about these great challenges. So I will let everybody come on up.